Briefly talk about an SAR project for Revolutionary War veterans that are buried in Harrison County. Fire away.
I'm a Marine. I don't briefly talk.
You're briefly talking today.
Okay. You got your timer on?
Yeah, I got your timing on you. I took too long on veterinary medicine. I got to keep moving.
If I don't know if y'all noticed whenever you came through the gate coming down here, but there's a post off to the side of it. And it says Revolutionary War soldiers buried in this cemetery. We have one. It's Henry Rankin. He was a private in Captain Anderson's company in the Lancaster, Pennsylvania militia. He is buried, he's right back here. You'll see a flag with a white post and a bunch of stones on the ground. I'll talk to you about that, but I want to talk about the project first. We are placing those posts. We started last year all throughout the county. I'm working on it here in Harrison County. We have people working in Belmont County and Jefferson County on it right now. And we're getting ready for the 250th of the semi-quincentennial.
Semi-sesquicentennial.
It doesn't roll off your tongue as easy as the bicentennial did. But
No, it does not.
It's the 250, and if you're like me, I was in high school in '76 when the bicentennial come around, so now we're here for this one. So if you were in school then, you're old, because it's 50 years later. But anyway, we're putting those out into the cemeteries all around here, wherever Revolutionary War soldiers are buried. But the neat thing about that, if you look at it, it's got a QR code down in the corner. You can go up that, scan it with your smartphone, and it will go to our database, which we completed back in the late 1990s for about 18 counties in eastern Ohio. And it will give you the complete history on Mr. Rankin, who he married, when he was born, when he died, what his kid's name was, what he did during the Revolutionary War, what he did when he came to Harrison County. You can find all that information plus reference points if you want to go even farther with him. Now this grave back here, if you look around here, you'll see a lot of stones on the ground. I've been looking for that grave for about 7 years. It used to be, from where you see that grave over to where this flag is over here, it was just like a lot of this, where it was all grown up and it was just a mess. I finally found that grave, and going with the WPA maps, and WPA maps was the Workers' Progress Act Administration. It took place what it was a program to get people back to work after the Depression. And they went throughout the whole state of Ohio to all cemeteries, and they made engineering drawings of each cemetery. You can find those maps at the county engineer's office. In every county in Ohio, you can find those maps, and it lists every cemetery in the county and in the state on those maps. Now, what's great about it is, this area where you're standing in, it is the old area. There is nowhere you can find out who's buried in this area. Those records were destroyed somewhere after 1941 when they did the WPA maps. Now the Genealogy Society has a plot out of this where they walked the cemeteries in the 80s, and they could read the stones as good as they could back then. But the WPA maps, its main purpose, besides to do those engineered drawings, was to locate every veteran buried in that cemetery. And it was from 1941, so it's World War I veterans all the way back to the Revolution. It hasn't. The records were available back then. After 1941, something happened to the records here in Green Township, and they were destroyed. So when you walk back here, you notice like a little tire tracks road area. That's where you're coming in the old section. There's nobody being buried back in here because they don't know where they're at. But they do know where they're at from those tracks on forward up into that area, so they're burying people still there. By using those WPA maps, I was able to go down here, and I took a tape measure, measured out. He was 10 graves down from this Civil War soldier. So I took a tape measure, measured about 40 feet, given about 4 foot wide for each cemetery spot or grave. And I put down a pole and I started probing. And it took me about a foot, almost a foot and a half, and I hit stone. And I walked around a little bit longer, hit stone, hit stone, hit stone. Dug down about 4 inches, and there was a nice strip of white marble there. As I dug it all out, the white marble disappeared into it deteriorates when it's below ground. And what you see is what's left of the headstone in that pile down there. But right now, we're working with the Veterans Administration. Fortunate thing about Mr. Rankin was that he filed for a pension for the Revolutionary War back in, I think it was 1829. And the interesting thing about it was Matthew Simpson, which was a nephew, cousin, uncle.
Matthew Simpson was the main bishop of the Methodist Church of the USA. He was one of the elders. This is his uncle.
This is uncle. His uncle was a judge up at the courthouse at the time, and he was the one that signed his pension to send it off to the government. Rankin also got a land grant for property around in this area, so hopefully we will get a headstone for him. If not, we have a program in place made by donations from the American Legions here in Harrison County, plus also if you've been down to the Queen of Hearts drawing, they had the 50-50 down there. They were gracious to let us to utilize that for the SAR, and we raised about $2,500 down there on that. So that allows us to buy about a $1,600 headstone. If the VA won't give him a headstone, then we can buy one for him that way.
Okay, so that's a good project, and they're making progress actually. So, all right, John Campbell. Now, if you look on the 1876 map of Harrison County, you'll see he's got coal and limestone outcroppings marked everywhere. And there was an area on the Caddis Branch Railroad. It's right where the winery is actually. It was called Limestone Cut. So there was a good quality limestone that when they cut through the railroad tracks there, they cut through a bunch of limestone. So they called that Limestone Cut. Dr. Kent owned that, and he sold that limestone to the Port Washington Blast Furnace Company. Now, what did they make in Port Washington that needed limestone for? What's that? Iron is right. They have a geological formation in Tuscarawas County called Black Band. Black Band. When you see Black Band, that means there's a lot of iron. And so they were taking this limestone. They may take limestone, coke, and Black Band, put it together, and they smelled iron out of it. So they employed about 30 men. They were almost all Irish and Scottish immigrants. And they had built a shanty that had 12 rooms in it, and the real small rooms, and that's where the workers stayed. And then they had a blacksmith shop. So they kept their powder in a zinc-lined box.
I got the backup.
Oh man.
That's like,
Oh, okay.
I told you I had a backup plan.
Yeah, you got a backup. Thanks, I appreciate that. You must
Thanks,
jam in your
James.
basement. Is this your karaoke machine, James?
I've never actually used it.
This is not your karaoke machine?
I can turn it up if you need me.
No, that's probably good, right? Okay. Good, I don't have to scream now. So at any rate, they made this zinc-lined box, and the box would hold 8 kegs of gunpowder. And they put this box out in the pit, and a rock fall landed on the box and damaged it. So to keep the powder from getting wet, they moved it into the blacksmith shop, which is a bad plan. So there were 5 3/4 barrels of gunpowder in this box. And when the blacksmith knocked the slake off of the iron and he pulled out of the furnace, he knocked the slake off of it, a spark went in there. So you had the blacksmith, which was I forgot his name, Thompson Hines. He was an Irish immigrant. He had no family, no permanent home. The superintendent was Andrew Lawson, who was from Scotland. He had just come to this country 4 or 5 years earlier. And then Dr. Kent was there. And then there was a mule there. And the paper said, the mule was tied to the door, no doubt meditating on the hardships of this wicked world, where mules do all the work. All mules are prone to meditation, and it is said that this mule was the worst case of has the worst case of meditation in existence. So if any of you have ever owned a mule, you know how true this is. So at any rate, that 3/4, the guy that went in and got the powder that morning did not put the lid on the open barrel. That spark went into the barrel and there was an explosion. James Hines was thrown about 30 feet. His clothes were on fire. The men ran out of the mine and they tore his clothes off of him. Papers in those days were very graphic. He was burnt, badly burnt. Large pieces of burnt, charred flesh fall off at the slightest touch. He was burnt clear through above his kidneys. After 2 days of severe suffering, he died. For Andrew Lawson, they couldn't find him, and here he was still in the building. And he came wobbling out, and he put his coat over his head, and the paper says his head looked like a finely charred piece of beef. And it became terribly swollen. Well, Dr. Kent, he was knocked over, but he recovered quickly. So because he's a veterinarian, and veterinarians are prone to do things, because we know. So he went out and he got the treatment of the day for burns, which was lime water and linseed oil. Can you imagine that being poured on your burns? Now, this was before germ theory had really taken hold. And, so lime water is obviously an antiseptic. And so anyhow, Andrew Lawson's head swelled twice the size of normal. They thought for sure he was going to die. 2 days later, his head size came down and he smoked his pipe. And he said, "This isn't the worst I've had. I've had worse in Scotland." And they said, for such a a man that's known to be a hot-headed Scotsman, he was the coolest guy we've ever seen. For the mule, it said the mule was found around the hill. Her eyes were burnt out and she was badly maimed. So I'm assuming, they shot her, but we don't know exactly what happened there. So at any rate, whenever there was a death back in those days, the coroner had to have an inquest. The coroner, even to this day, has basically the same powers as the sheriff. So can bring in witnesses, subpoena witnesses, and do all this sort of thing. With modern forensics and stuff, even though coroner's inquests are still legal, they're very, very rarely used. But they would take 6 nearby people. John Campbell was one of them. And they would go and they would examine the body. They would take testimony. And then they would assign a cause of death. In his case, it was severe burns. And then they would assign blame. And it's really interesting when you read these coroner's inquest. You'll read rockfall miner killed by crushing, no one to blame. Painter, scaffolding collapsed, crushed chest, no one to blame. And so it just, every one of them's the same way. Nobody ever got blamed. So anyhow, they would call these and they would have to go and they would look at these, all these bodies, and then they would sign these death certificates, essentially. And I don't know, Sue, are our coroner's inquests somewhere? Do you know? We do have some? Okay. Yeah, I haven't looked at any of ours, but yeah. So anyhow, coroner's inquests are not common, but they are still legal. And I wouldn't expect one to be called, but if there was, where they used to be called, after about 1910, they used to be called in cases where the coroner wanted to get an idea of what the public thought and whether they could take charges to the grand jury. And so they would bring them in and say, this is what we've got. What do you guys think about the cause of death? Can we assign blame? And if the coroner's inquest was 100%, yeah, we can assign blame, a lot of times they would send it to the prosecutor and the grand jury. If they, the general public, 2 of the 4 thought, well, I don't think that'll happen, then they would oftentimes not take charges to the grand jury. But in modern times, since the World War II, I don't think there's been a coroner's inquest that I know of in this county. So that is John Campbell. Now, we're just going to stay right here because where's Asbury? Right over there?
Right on the back side of the room.
There, we just turn around there. Right there somewhere. Right there. Here he is. Okay. That's Asbury Birney. So Asbury Birney joined the church in 1840. These churches would have week-long revivals. And he was 25 years old when he got his calling, and he joined the church. And the preacher at that time was a guy named Reverend Edward White. At that period in time, the Methodist preachers were on a circuit. And so they had a house, and this circuit would change over time, but they had a house, and at one point it was in Jewett. And so that preacher would be responsible for this church, Jewett, several other small Methodist churches in the area. And this preacher here was a guy named Reverend Edward, what did I say, Smith or White? I forget. White. And Reverend White was an abolitionist. In 1836, there was a lot of, the Methodist Church was starting to have a lot of issues with slavery. The Wesley, the founder of the Methodist Church, was strictly anti-slavery. Believed it was a sin, believed it was completely wrong. But the Methodist religion spread in the South. And so by 1836, it was starting to come to a head, and Georgia brought to the National Methodist Conference, brought I forget what they call them in the Methodist Church, but basically they said they wanted the church to approve the statement that slavery as it's practiced in the South is not amoral. And this kind of created a stir, and some of the northern churches wanted them to censure the Georgia people, and they never could come to a conclusion. So what they decided to do was basically don't ask, don't tell. The Pittsburgh Convention decided that all of the Methodist churches in its area were not going to preach abolition. And they were just going to kind of ignore the problem. Well, Reverend White went to Cadiz and he preached a sermon. And the sermon was actually, I read the whole sermon. He was preaching against things like wearing jewelry. The Bible says you're not supposed to adorn yourself with gold. Look out in here. How many people have gold on their fingers? So he was a very conservative, old-fashioned Methodist, and it was basically a sermon against modernity. And there was a paragraph in there where he says that the Methodist Church tolerates the greatest sin of all, the sin of slavery. We are graduating our preachers up to their elbows in blood of the sin of slavery and sending them to preach to the people. The Roman Church gave indulgences in the Middle Ages for money, and this is worse than that. And he was turned in to the conference, and he was put on trial. 7 charges. None of them had anything to do with abolition. And the reason we know all about this is he wrote a book about it. He wrote a pamphlet, and he goes over all the testimony, defends himself, goes on and on and on. He ended up getting excommunicated. And the historian, a guy named Fletcher Birney, wrote a history of this church in 1894, said he was a contrarian, but now most people think he was right. And so he was kicked out of the Methodist Church, not for preaching abolition, but for saying the Methodist Church was worse than Catholicism. And that was the charge that stuck. 1 out of 7. Nothing worse than saying you're worse than a Catholic. So my man got the boot from the Methodist Church. He went on to be a Wesleyan Methodist. Wesleyans had started up after 1836 as an abolition branch of the Methodist Church. And so when we went through this schism in the church a couple years ago, this church is now Global Methodist after being United Methodist. These schisms, it's not the first one. It's not going to be the last one. It's just the way it goes. These, we're churches. We have different ideas. God speaks to everybody differently. And how people hear things and interpret things is different. And sometimes it just leads to separation. So, at that point, he thought the seminarians were going out into the world with blood up to their elbows because of the sin of slavery. In the end, I'd say he was on the right side of history. Okay, that's it for that one.